June 12, 1943. Dawn broke over the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Technical Sergeant Raymond Wilson of the United States Marine Corps sat alone on a jagged rock overlooking Iron Bottom Sound, fiddling with a coil of copper wire and a small radio component. The 26-year-old communications specialist believed he was merely improving field equipment for his unit. He could not have imagined that within 3 months, his innovative modifications would contribute to altering the course of the Pacific conflict and cause the Japanese Naval Command to completely reassess their strategy in the Solomon Islands campaign. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how one Marine's ingenuity with radio technology transformed a desperate strategic situation into one of the most effective naval intelligence operations of the war, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapons aren't found in an arsenal, but in the innovative minds of ordinary people forced to do extraordinary things. Technical Sergeant Raymond Wilson wiped sweat from his brow as he continued adjusting the delicate components of his modified radio receiver. At 6 feet tall with broad shoulders, Wilson had hands that seemed too large for such precise work, yet they moved with surprising dexterity. Born in Harlem, New York, Wilson had studied electrical engineering for 2 years at Howard University before enlisting in the Marines in 1941, shortly after Pearl Harbor. "Still playing with your radio toys, Wilson?" called out Lieutenant James Forrester as he approached, a map case tucked under his arm. "Command needs that equipment operational, not reimagined." Wilson stood quickly, his dark brown eyes meeting Forrester's gaze. "Sir, these aren't toys. I think I've found a way to extend our signal reception range by almost 30%. Forrester raised an eyebrow. 30%? That's quite a claim." "Yes, sir. By reconfiguring the antenna and adjusting the impedance with this custom matching circuit I've designed, we can pick up much fainter signals." Wilson held up a strange arrangement of copper wire wrapped around a carved piece of local hardwood. "And where exactly did you get authorization to modify military equipment, Sergeant?" Wilson's expression fell slightly. I didn't, sir. It's just something I've been working on during downtime." Forrester studied Wilson for a moment, then sighed. "Well, 30% is 30%. Show me how it works." Across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita sat in his quarters aboard the heavy cruiser Chokai, flagship of the Japanese Second Fleet. Maps and intelligence reports covered his desk as he contemplated the next phase of naval operations in the Solomon Islands. The Americans had proven to be far more resilient than expected. "Admiral, Commander Ishikawa requests permission to enter," announced his aide from the doorway. "Send him in," Kurita replied, not looking up from his papers. Commander Toshio Ishikawa entered and bowed slightly. "Admiral, the encrypted communication protocols for the fleet movements have been updated as ordered. All vessel captains have the new code books and frequency rotation schedules." Kurita nodded approvingly. "Excellent. And what of our intelligence regarding American signal interception capabilities? Our sources indicate they have had minimal success decoding our naval transmissions. Their equipment is sophisticated, but cannot effectively penetrate our encryption methods. Our communication security remains strong." "Very good." Kurita tapped his finger thoughtfully on the map. "We cannot afford any compromise in our communications. The upcoming transport convoy to Bougainville must proceed without American interference. With 8 capital ships and 14 transports, it represents our largest reinforcement effort since taking Rabaul." "Yes, Admiral. The Americans have no way of knowing our intentions or timetables." Back on Guadalcanal, Wilson spent the next week refining his modification. Working with Lieutenant Commander Nathan Hirsch, a naval intelligence officer recently assigned to the Marine Unit, Wilson explained the technical aspects of his invention. "The standard-issue radio receivers have a fundamental limitation in their antenna design," Wilson explained, sketching a diagram in the dirt with a stick. "The signal-to-noise ratio drops significantly at certain frequencies, particularly those used by Japanese naval communications." Hirsch, a slender man with wire-rimmed glasses, who had been a physics professor at Massachusetts Institute of Technology before the war, studied Wilson's drawings with growing interest. "So, you've created a tunable impedance matching network?" Wilson nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly, sir. By adjusting this coil configuration, we can optimize reception for specific frequency bands. It's like tuning a musical instrument to hear notes that would otherwise be too faint." "And you built this from scrap parts?" "Yes, sir. Some salvaged copper wire from damaged equipment, local hardwood carved to precise dimensions, and a few components well, borrowed from supply." Hirsch chuckled. "Borrowed, eh? Well, I think supply can spare the parts if this works as well as you claim." He grew serious. "How confident are you that this can intercept Japanese naval communications?" Wilson's expression became somber. "Sir, 2 nights ago I picked up what I believe was a Japanese transmission from at least 200 miles away. I couldn't understand it, of course, but the signal pattern matched what intelligence has identified as their naval communication format." Hirsch's eyes widened. 200 miles. Our standard equipment can barely manage half that distance for those frequencies." "Yes, sir. And with a few more refinements, I believe I can push it even further." The following day, Hirsch arranged a formal demonstration for Colonel Walter Jackson, the commanding officer of the intelligence detachment on Guadalcanal. Several other officers attended, their faces displaying varying degrees of skepticism. "Gentlemen, Technical Sergeant Wilson has developed a modification that may significantly enhance our signals intelligence capabilities," Hirsch began. "Sergeant, please proceed." Wilson, nervous but determined, connected his modified antenna to a standard radio set. "Sirs, what you're looking at is what I call a variable harmonic resonance antenna. It allows us to tune into specific frequency bands with much greater sensitivity than our standard equipment." The officers exchanged glances as Wilson continued to explain the technical aspects of his design. Colonel Jackson, a career Marine with little patience for technical jargon, interrupted. "Skip the engineering lecture, Sergeant. Does it work or not?" "Yes, sir, it does. Allow me to demonstrate." Wilson began adjusting the dials, his fingers moving with practiced precision. Static filled the air, then gradually resolved into faint but distinct signals. "What you're hearing now is a transmission originating approximately 180 miles northeast of our position," Wilson explained. "Based on signal characteristics, it's almost certainly from a Japanese vessel." Commander Harold Winters, a naval intelligence officer, stepped forward with interest. "Can you isolate that signal better?" Wilson nodded, making further adjustments. The transmission became clearer, the distinctive rhythms of Japanese code becoming unmistakable. "Impressive," Winters admitted, "but picking up signals is only half the battle. We still need to decode them." "That's true, sir," Wilson agreed, "but my modification provides something even more valuable than just extended range." He pointed to a crude oscilloscope he had cobbled together. "It allows us to identify specific transmission patterns unique to individual vessels. Like a fingerprint, each ship's radio equipment has subtle differences in its signal characteristics." The implications dawned on Colonel Jackson. "You're saying we could identify specific Japanese ships just by how their transmissions sound, even without decoding the content?" "Precisely, sir. With enough samples and proper documentation, we could track the movements of individual vessels, or at least specific vessel classes." The room fell silent as the officers considered this possibility. 3 days later, Wilson found himself reassigned to a newly formed signals intelligence team headed by Commander Winters. A secure facility had been hastily established in an abandoned plantation house, and Wilson's antenna design was being replicated by a team of technicians. "Your design is remarkably elegant in its simplicity, Sergeant," commented Lieutenant Commander Eliza Morgan, a cryptanalysis expert who had been rushed to Guadalcanal from Pearl Harbor. One of the few women serving in a forward area, Morgan had short brown hair and intense green eyes that missed nothing. "With minimal materials, you've achieved what our engineers back home couldn't with far more sophisticated equipment." Wilson smiled, pleased by the recognition. "Sometimes the best solutions are the simplest ones, ma'am. Growing up, we couldn't afford to replace broken radios, so I learned to fix them with whatever was available." "Necessity is the mother of invention," Morgan replied with a nod. Now let's see if we can match these signal patterns to specific vessels. Over the next 2 weeks, the team worked tirelessly, cataloging transmission characteristics from various Japanese ships. They developed a rudimentary database, noting distinct patterns in signal strength, frequency stability, and modulation characteristics. "It's working," Winters announced one evening as the team gathered around a large chart of the Solomon Islands. "We've positively identified the signatures of 3 Japanese cruisers and what appears to be a carrier group moving north of Bougainville." Wilson felt a surge of pride, but it was tempered by the knowledge that they had only scratched the surface of what might be possible. "The problem," Morgan pointed out, "is that we're still only picking up transmissions when Japanese vessels are actively broadcasting. If they maintain radio silence, we're blind." "What if we could make them break radio silence?" Wilson suggested thoughtfully. The room fell quiet as all eyes turned to him. "What exactly do you have in mind, Sergeant?" Winters asked. "Well, sir, what if we could transmit something that would force them to respond, not directly to us, but to their own command?" Morgan leaned forward, intrigued. "Elaborate, please." Wilson took a deep breath. "If we could mimic the transmission characteristics of a Japanese vessel in distress, it might prompt nearby ships to respond, breaking their radio silence and revealing their positions." Winters frowned. "That's a dangerous game, Sergeant. If they realize we're falsifying transmissions, they'll change their entire communication protocol." "Yes, sir, but we wouldn't need to transmit actual Japanese code. Just create a signal that appears to be from a Japanese vessel that's suddenly gone silent or is transmitting an incomplete distress pattern." Colonel Jackson, who had been listening silently, finally spoke. "It's audacious, perhaps too audacious. But the potential intelligence value is significant." The discussion continued late into the night, with various objections raised and addressed. Eventually, a compromise was reached. They would attempt Wilson's plan, but on a limited scale, targeting a small Japanese convoy reportedly moving through the area. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese cruiser Chokai, Vice Admiral Kurita received troubling news. "Admiral, we've lost contact with the supply convoy to Bougainville," reported his communications officer. "Their last transmission was received 12 hours ago, just northeast of the Santa Cruz Islands." Kurita's brow furrowed. "Weather conditions in the area?" "Clear skies, moderate seas, nothing that would explain communication difficulties." "American air patrols in the vicinity?" "None reported, sir, but our reconnaissance has been limited." Kurita studied the map thoughtfully. "Send the destroyers Amatsukaze and Yukikaze to investigate. Have them maintain strict radio silence until they locate the convoy." "Yes, Admiral." Back on Guadalcanal, Wilson's team prepared for their first active deception operation. Using his modified equipment, Wilson had created a transmitter capable of mimicking the signal characteristics of Japanese naval vessels. "Remember," Winters instructed, "we're not transmitting actual coded messages. Just a partial distress signal that cuts off abruptly. Make it appear as if a vessel was damaged and its transmission equipment failed mid-message." Wilson nodded, hands slightly trembling as he adjusted the equipment. "Ready, sir." "Proceed." Wilson activated the transmitter, sending out a brief burst that mimicked the distinctive pattern of a Japanese destroyer. The signal continued for 20 seconds before abruptly terminating. "Now we wait," Morgan said, turning to the receiving equipment. "If there are any Japanese vessels in the area, they may investigate or at least report the incident." 4 tense hours passed with no response. The team was beginning to think their plan had failed when suddenly one of the receivers crackled to life. "Contact!" exclaimed Petty Officer David Chen, who was monitoring the frequencies. "Japanese transmission, bearing 015, approximately 140 miles from our position." Wilson rushed to the equipment, adjusting his modified antenna to better capture the signal. "It's definitely one of their destroyers. Signal pattern matches what we've identified as their Kagero class." Morgan was already taking notes, documenting the time, signal strength, and characteristics. They took the bait. They're reporting what they believe was a distress signal from one of their own vessels. Winters smiled grimly. "And in doing so, they've revealed their position." Excellent work, people. Let's track them. Over the next few days, the team refined their technique. They discovered that by carefully timing their false transmissions, they could create the impression of a Japanese vessel moving along a specific route, drawing out responses from actual Japanese ships in the area. The beauty of this approach, Wilson explained to Colonel Jackson during a progress report, is that the Japanese have no reason to suspect deception. From their perspective, they're simply responding to one of their own vessels in potential distress. Jackson nodded, impressed despite his initial skepticism, and each time they respond, they reveal not just their position, but their very existence in the area. Exactly, sir. Intelligence estimates there are at least 15 major Japanese warships operating in the Solomon Islands. So far, we've positively identified 8 of them using this method. The operation continued to expand, with Wilson training additional technicians in his techniques. By early July, they had mapped significant portions of the Japanese naval deployment in the region, providing invaluable intelligence to Allied commanders. On July 15th, the team intercepted a series of transmissions suggesting a major Japanese naval movement was underway. Unlike previous patterns, these communications indicated multiple vessel groups converging toward a common point. "This is big," Winters announced to the assembled team. "Based on transmission volumes and patterns, we're looking at possibly their entire regional fleet mobilizing." "Target?" asked Morgan. "Unknown, but given the convergence pattern here," he pointed to a map, "they appear to be assembling for a major operation aimed at either Tulagi or possibly even Guadalcanal itself." Wilson studied the plotted positions. "Sir, what if we used our deception technique not just to locate their vessels, but to actually disrupt their operations?" Winters raised an eyebrow. "What do you have in mind, Sergeant?" "If we can create phantom Japanese ships in distress at strategic locations, we might be able to divert some of their vessels from their intended course. At minimum, it would create confusion in their command structure." The idea was bold, perhaps too bold, but the potential benefits were too significant to ignore. 2 days later, Admiral William Halsey received an urgent briefing at his headquarters in Noumea, New Caledonia. The intelligence coming from Guadalcanal was unexpected and potentially game-changing. "Let me understand this correctly," Halsey said, pacing the room. "A Marine Sergeant has developed a method to not only detect Japanese naval communications at extended ranges, but also to identify specific vessels by their transmission characteristics." "Yes, sir," replied his intelligence officer, "and they've taken it a step further. They're now able to simulate Japanese transmissions convincingly enough to elicit responses from actual Japanese vessels, thereby revealing their positions." Halsey whistled softly. "That's either brilliant or insane." "Possibly both. What's this sergeant's name?" "Technical Sergeant Raymond Wilson, sir, communications specialist with prior electrical engineering training. And this intelligence about a major Japanese naval concentration northeast of the Solomons? How confident are we in its accuracy?" "Very confident, Admiral. Multiple confirmation sources, including submarine reconnaissance. The Japanese are assembling a significant force. At least 2 carriers, 4 heavy cruisers, and numerous destroyers and transports." Halsey studied the map, his mind racing through tactical options. This could be their attempt to retake Guadalcanal, or possibly push further into our supply lines. He was quiet for a moment, then looked up with determination. "Send word to Wilson's team, full authorization to continue and expand their operation, and get me detailed plans for intercepting this Japanese force." On Guadalcanal, Wilson's team received their new orders with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Their small experiment had evolved into a full-scale naval deception operation with potentially significant strategic implications. "We'll need to expand our transmission capabilities," Wilson told the team, now grown to 15 personnel. "Multiple synchronized transmitters to create the impression of several vessels in distress or under attack." Working day and night, they prepared for what would become known as Operation Phantom Fleet. The concept was audacious: create the impression of an American naval force attacking Japanese supply vessels in an area well away from the actual Japanese concentration point. "If this works," Morgan explained to the newest team members, The Japanese will divert significant forces to counter a threat that doesn't exist, weakening their main thrust and giving our actual naval forces a substantial advantage. On July 28th, as dawn broke over the Solomon Sea, Wilson gave the order to begin the operation. Multiple transmitters activated simultaneously, broadcasting carefully crafted Japanese distress signals and response patterns. "First responses coming in," announced Chen after 30 tense minutes. "Japanese destroyer group approximately 120 miles northwest of our simulated position." Wilson nodded, adjusting his equipment. "Increase transmission power on stations 2 and 4. Make it appear as if our Phantom vessels are actively engaging the Japanese supply convoy." The deception continued throughout the day, with Japanese communications indicating growing confusion and concern. By evening, intelligence reports confirmed that a substantial Japanese force, including a light carrier and 2 heavy cruisers, had been diverted from the main fleet to investigate. "It's working better than we anticipated," Winters told Wilson as they took a brief rest. "Halsey's forces will intercept their now diminished main fleet tomorrow morning." Wilson should have felt elated, but instead, a growing concern nagged at him. "Sir, there's something that doesn't feel right. The Japanese responses seem too predictable." "What do you mean?" "Well, they've diverted forces exactly as we hoped, but there's been no indication they suspect deception. For a navy with their experience, that seems unusual." Winters considered this. "Perhaps we've simply executed the plan that well." "Perhaps," Wilson agreed, though he remained uneasy. In the early hours of July 29th, as the operation continued, Wilson's concerns suddenly crystallized into a terrifying possibility. "Commander," he called urgently to Winters, "I need to speak with you immediately." Winters hurried over. "What is it?" "Sir, I've been analyzing the response patterns from the Japanese vessels, and I've noticed something disturbing. The signal characteristics of some of the responding vessels have subtle inconsistencies compared to our previous identifications." "Meaning what exactly?" Wilson took a deep breath. "Meaning I think they might be doing to us what we're doing to them, creating phantom responses to make us think our deception is working." The implication hit Winters like a physical blow. "If you're right, then Halsey could be sailing into a trap," Wilson finished grimly. The entire team mobilized instantly, reviewing all intercepted transmissions with new scrutiny. Within an hour, Wilson's suspicion gained frightening credibility. "These response patterns," Morgan pointed out, "they're too regular, too textbook. Real naval communications, especially in crisis situations, show more variation." "And look at these signal strength analyses," added Chen. "The variation doesn't match natural atmospheric conditions." Colonel Jackson was immediately informed, and an urgent message was dispatched to Halsey's command. The question now was whether the warning would reach him in time. As dawn broke on July 29th, the Solomon Sea was calm, its surface a mirror reflecting the growing light. Far below the surface, Imperial Japanese Navy submarines lay in wait, their commanders anticipating the arrival of American naval forces responding to what they believed was a vulnerable Japanese convoy. Above the water, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft maintained a patrol pattern, searching for the first signs of the approaching American fleet. On the bridge of the heavy cruiser Chokai, Vice Admiral Kurita awaited reports with growing impatience. "Still no sighting of American vessels?" he asked his aide. "No, Admiral. Our aircraft report no contact within a 200-kilometer radius of the designated interception point." Kurita frowned. "And what of the distress signals from our supply convoy?" "They continue as reported, sir. The convoy commander requests immediate assistance." Something didn't feel right to Kurita. The Americans should have responded by now if they had detected the supposedly vulnerable convoy. Unless... "Send a direct inquiry to the convoy commander," Kurita ordered suddenly. "Specific details about vessel damage and positions." 20 minutes later, the response came back and Kurita's suspicion was confirmed. The details provided by the convoy didn't match the known composition of the actual supply group. "It appears we are not the only ones engaging in deception," Kurita observed grimly. "Signal the fleet. Terminate Operation Phantom Response immediately. All vessels to rendezvous at secondary assembly point. The Japanese admiral had just realized that they had been engaged in a mutual deception with the Americans, each side believing they were successfully misleading the other. It was an unprecedented situation in naval warfare. At approximately the same time, Admiral Halsey received the urgent warning from Guadalcanal. After reviewing the evidence, he made a similar decision, ordering his forces to withdraw from their planned intercept course and regroup. Back on Guadalcanal, Wilson and his team monitored the rapidly changing situation with tense anticipation. Japanese transmissions have shifted pattern, Chen reported. They've abandoned the deception frequency sets and reverted to standard communication protocols. They know, Wilson said simply. They figured out what we were doing. And we figured out what they were doing, Morgan added. It's unprecedented, a double bluff where both sides detected the other's deception. Winters nodded slowly. The question now is, what happens next? For 3 days, an unusual calm settled over the Solomon Sea. Both American and Japanese naval forces seemed to have withdrawn to reconsider their strategies. On Guadalcanal, Wilson's team continued monitoring all frequencies, but Japanese naval communications had become frustratingly minimal. They've changed their transmission protocols, Wilson explained to Colonel Jackson during a briefing. New frequencies, new encryption patterns. Our previous identification methods are now of limited use. Jackson frowned. So we're back to square one. Not entirely, sir. We still have the enhanced reception capability, and we're already working on identifying the new signal patterns, but the Japanese are being far more cautious now. And what about our deception techniques? Wilson hesitated. Compromised, at least temporarily. They'll be suspicious of any unusual transmission patterns now. The colonel was silent for a moment, then asked, "In your opinion, Sergeant, was the operation a success or a failure?" Wilson considered the question carefully. "Neither, sir, or perhaps both. We didn't achieve our immediate tactical objective of diverting their fleet into a disadvantageous position. But strategically, we forced them to completely reassess their communication security. They'll be more cautious, more hesitant in their movements. And every hour they delay gives us more time to reinforce our positions here." Jackson nodded thoughtfully. "A valid assessment. And there's something else to consider. This operation has demonstrated the potential of signals intelligence in a way that cannot be ignored. Headquarters is already discussing the formation of a dedicated signals intelligence unit based on your work." Wilson's eyes widened in surprise. "Sir?" "Yes, Sergeant. In fact, I've been authorized to inform you that you're being promoted to Master Sergeant and transferred to a new Signals Intelligence Development Unit. You'll be working directly with Naval Intelligence to refine and expand your techniques." For Wilson, who had joined the Marines with few expectations beyond serving his country, this recognition was unexpected and deeply meaningful. Yet he knew the real work was just beginning. The Japanese would adapt, improve their security, and develop new communication methods. It would be an ongoing battle of technological innovation and human ingenuity. As the sun set over Guadalcanal that evening, Wilson stood alone on the same rocky outcrop where he had first tested his modified antenna. In the distance, the waters of Iron Bottom Sound reflected the fading light, serene and peaceful, despite being the graveyard for so many ships from both sides of the conflict. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adaptations required in this invisible war of signals and deception. For now, though, Wilson allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. His wire trick, born of necessity and innovation, had evolved into something that might genuinely help turn the tide of the Pacific campaign. What he couldn't know then was that his greatest contribution to the war effort was still to come, and that the Japanese commanders would soon face a threat they could never have anticipated, a signals intelligence operation that would ultimately help send their entire remaining Pacific fleet to the bottom of the ocean. August 3rd, 1943. The morning sky over Pearl Harbor was a brilliant blue, unmarred by clouds. Master Sergeant Raymond Wilson stood on the tarmac of Naval Air Station Ford Island, squinting against the harsh sunlight as he watched a transport plane taxi toward him. Just 1 week earlier, he had been on Guadalcanal, working with his improvised equipment. Now he found himself in Hawaii, summoned to contribute to a much larger operation than he had ever imagined. "Sergeant Wilson," a naval lieutenant approached, extending his hand. "Lieutenant Robert Ambrose, welcome to Pearl Harbor." "Thank you, sir," Wilson replied, shaking the offered hand, "though I'm still not entirely clear on why I've been brought here." Ambrose smiled. "All will be explained shortly. Commander Layton is eager to meet you." As they drove across the island to the intelligence headquarters at Macalapa, Wilson marveled at the transformation Pearl Harbor had undergone since the devastating attack less than 2 years prior. New facilities had sprung up everywhere, and the harbor itself bustled with activity as ships prepared for upcoming operations. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" Ambrose commented, noticing Wilson's wide-eyed gaze. "Hard to believe what it looked like after the attack. Yes, sir, American industry at its finest." "Indeed. And speaking of American ingenuity, that's precisely why you're here, Sergeant." Wilson was ushered into a secure briefing room where several naval officers and civilian technicians were already gathered. At the head of the table sat Commander Edwin Layton, Pacific Fleet Intelligence Officer and one of Admiral Nimitz's most trusted advisors. "Sergeant Wilson," Layton greeted him warmly, "your reputation precedes you. Please have a seat." Wilson sat nervously, acutely aware that he was the only enlisted man and the only black serviceman in a room full of officers. "Gentlemen," Layton began, "Sergeant Wilson here has developed a signals intelligence technique that has already proven its value in the Solomon Islands campaign. I've brought him here to see if we can apply his methods on a larger scale." He turned to Wilson. "Sergeant, I understand your technique allows for the identification of individual Japanese vessels by the unique characteristics of their radio transmissions. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Wilson replied, his initial nervousness giving way to professional confidence. "Each vessel's radio equipment has subtle but distinctive electronic signatures that can be identified with properly tuned receiving equipment." "Fascinating," remarked one of the civilian technicians. "Similar to acoustic signature identification for submarines, but applied to electromagnetic emissions." "Exactly, sir," Wilson agreed. "Just as each engine has a unique sound pattern, each radio transmitter has unique signal characteristics." Over the next 2 hours, Wilson explained his techniques in detail, demonstrating with equipment he had brought from Guadalcanal. The technical staff asked numerous questions, many expressing surprise at the sophistication of Wilson's methods, given the limited resources with which he had developed them. "What most impresses me," Commander Layton said after the presentation, "is not just the technical achievement, but the strategic application. Using deception transmissions to manipulate enemy movements shows remarkable tactical thinking." Wilson nodded modestly. "It seemed like a natural extension of the identification capabilities, sir." "Well, Sergeant, we believe your methods could be crucial to a major operation we're planning. Have you ever heard of the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific?" "FRUPAC, sir. Only by reputation. They're the codebreakers, right?" "Indeed. The work you've been doing complements theirs perfectly. While they focus on decrypting the content of Japanese transmissions, your methods could help us identify which specific vessels are transmitting, even when we can't decode the messages themselves." Layton paused, studying Wilson thoughtfully. "What I'm about to share is classified at the highest level. The Japanese are developing a new naval encryption code to replace their current JN-25 system, which we've partially broken. When they implement this new code, we may temporarily lose our ability to read their communications." The implication was clear. During such a gap, Wilson's techniques for identifying vessels by their transmission characteristics might become the primary means of tracking Japanese fleet movements. The following week was a whirlwind of activity. Wilson worked closely with FRUPAC technicians to adapt his methods to their more sophisticated equipment. The results exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. "The sensitivity improvement is remarkable," exclaimed Lieutenant Commander Joseph Finnegan, a senior FRUPAC officer, as they tested the modified receivers. "We're picking up signals that would have been completely undetectable before." Wilson beamed with pride. "And with these directional antenna arrays, we can triangulate positions with much greater accuracy than was possible on Guadalcanal." "Sergeant," Finnegan said, his tone suddenly serious, "I don't think you fully appreciate what you've accomplished here. With stations on Midway, Hawaii, and several forward bases all using your methods, we could potentially track the entire Japanese fleet in real time." The implications were staggering. Naval warfare had always been constrained by the vast emptiness of the ocean and the difficulty of locating enemy forces. Wilson's techniques promised to lift that veil of uncertainty, at least partially. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita was facing increasing pressure from Imperial headquarters. The Americans had seized the initiative in the Solomon Islands, and Japanese supply lines were under constant threat. "The situation becomes untenable," Kurita explained to his staff aboard the Chokai. "Our forces in Bougainville and Rabaul cannot be adequately supplied under current conditions." Commander Ishikawa nodded grimly. "And our intelligence suggests the Americans are preparing for a major offensive, possibly targeting the Gilbert Islands." "Yes, which is why Imperial headquarters has ordered a significant redeployment of our fleet assets. We are to consolidate our forces for a decisive engagement when the Americans make their move." "And our communications security, Admiral." Kurita's expression darkened. "That remains a serious concern. The recent incident in the Solomons suggests the Americans have developed new signals intelligence capabilities. Effective immediately, all fleet units will implement the new Type 1 communications protocol and encryption system." What the Japanese commanders couldn't know was that their new encryption system, while more complex than its predecessor, had already been compromised thanks to American code-breaking efforts. More importantly, the underlying transmission methods, the very signals that Wilson had learned to identify, remained largely unchanged. By early September, a network of signal intelligence stations using Wilson's techniques was operational across the Pacific. From Midway to Australia, specially trained technicians monitored the airwaves, cataloging and identifying Japanese naval transmissions. A central coordination center at Pearl Harbor compiled the information, creating an unprecedented real-time picture of Japanese naval deployments. "It's extraordinary," Admiral Nimitz remarked during a briefing with his senior staff. 6 months ago, we had to rely on submarine sightings and aerial reconnaissance to locate enemy fleet units. Now we can track their movements across thousands of miles of ocean." Commander Layton nodded. "And much of the credit goes to Sergeant Wilson's innovations, Admiral. His methods have transformed our signals intelligence capabilities." "Then I want to meet this sergeant," Nimitz declared. "Bring him to the next strategic planning session." The following day, Wilson found himself in a situation he could never have imagined, sitting in on a high-level strategic planning meeting with Admiral Chester Nimitz and his senior commanders. The focus was Operation Galvanic, the upcoming invasion of Tarawa and Makin in the Gilbert Islands. "Gentlemen," Nimitz began, "the success of our Central Pacific offensive depends on accurate intelligence regarding Japanese naval responses. Commander Layton, please introduce our guest and explain his contribution." Layton gestured toward Wilson. "This is Master Sergeant Raymond Wilson, the developer of the signal identification techniques I've previously briefed you on. Sergeant, would you explain to the Admiral how your methods might be applied to Operation Galvanic?" Fighting his nervousness, Wilson stood and approached the large map of the Pacific. "Admiral, our signal monitoring network now covers most of the central and southwestern Pacific. When the Japanese fleet mobilizes in response to our Gilbert's operation, we should be able to track their major units in near real time." "Even with their new encryption system?" asked Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. "Yes, sir. Their encryption protects the content of their messages, but not the distinctive transmission characteristics of their radio equipment. Each major vessel, particularly their carriers and battleships, has a unique fingerprint that we can identify regardless of encryption." Nimitz studied the map thoughtfully. "And what about deliberate deception? After your operation in the Solomons, surely they're aware of such techniques." "They're certainly more cautious, Admiral," Wilson acknowledged, "but our network gives us a significant advantage. A single deception might fool one listening station, but it's much harder to fool multiple stations simultaneously. By triangulating transmissions from different points, we can verify authenticity." The planning session continued for hours, with Wilson contributing insights on signals intelligence capabilities. By the end, a bold plan had emerged, not just to track Japanese responses to the Gilbert's invasion, but to actively manipulate those responses using sophisticated deception techniques. "Sergeant Wilson," Nimitz said as the meeting concluded, "I'm impressed by both your technical innovations and your strategic thinking. I'm recommending you for a commission as an officer in naval intelligence. Your talents are clearly wasted as an enlisted man." Wilson was momentarily speechless. The possibility of becoming an officer, something virtually unheard of for a black serviceman at that time, had never occurred to him. "Thank you, sir," he finally managed. "I'm honored, but—" "I'm a Marine, Admiral," Nimitz chuckled. "Well, perhaps we can arrange something with your corps. In any case, I want you fully involved in the signals intelligence operation for Galvanic." November 20th, 1943. Dawn broke over the Central Pacific as the massive American invasion force approached the Gilbert Islands. Operation Galvanic was underway, with thousands of Marines preparing to assault the heavily fortified atoll of Tarawa. In a specialized communications center aboard the command ship USS Pennsylvania, now Lieutenant Raymond Wilson monitored the airwaves with intense concentration. His commissioning had been expedited by direct intervention from Admiral Nimitz, though he had indeed remained with the Marine Corps as he had wished. "Anything yet?" asked Commander Layton, who had come to observe the operation personally. "Nothing significant, sir," Wilson replied. "A few routine transmissions from Japanese outposts, but no major fleet movements detected." "They'll respond," Layton said confidently. "They cannot allow us to establish a foothold in the Gilberts without a fight." As the morning progressed and the initial landings on Tarawa began, the signal monitoring continued. By mid-afternoon, the first indications of Japanese naval activity were detected. "Contact. Bearing 275, approximately 600 miles northwest of our position," reported radioman First Class Thomas Jenkins, one of Wilson's trained operators. "Signal characteristics match the carrier Shokaku." Wilson moved quickly to verify the identification. "Confirmed. And there's more. At least 2 heavy cruisers accompanying her. Looks like they're mobilizing a response force." Over the next 24 hours, as the bloody battle for Tarawa intensified on shore, the signals intelligence team tracked the approaching Japanese task force. By combining Wilson's identification techniques with partial decryption of intercepted messages, they were able to determine that the force consisted of 2 fleet carriers, 4 heavy cruisers, and numerous destroyers. "They're committing significant assets," Layton observed, "exactly as expected." Wilson nodded, but something was troubling him. "The movement pattern seems odd, sir. They're approaching too directly, making no attempt to conceal their course." "Perhaps they're confident in their encryption," Layton suggested. "Maybe, but—" Wilson studied the plotting board intently. "Sir, I think this might be a deliberate feint. The transmission patterns are too regular, too obvious." Layton frowned. "So you think they're using our own deception techniques against us?" "It's possible, sir. They learned from our operation in the Solomons." A tense discussion followed, with opinions divided on whether the approaching Japanese force was genuine or a deception. Finally, Admiral Spruance, commanding the overall operation, made a decision. "We proceed as if this is their main response force, but we maintain reserve units in position to counter any secondary thrust," he ordered. "And we implement our own deception plan immediately." Wilson's team sprang into action, activating specially prepared transmitters that mimicked American carrier communications. These transmitters, placed on small vessels operating well away from the main fleet, created the impression of a vulnerable American force separated from the invasion fleet. By dawn, on November 22nd, the deception appeared to be working. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft were observed searching the area where the phantom American force had been positioned. "They've taken the bait," Layton announced triumphantly. "Their main force has altered course toward our phantom fleet." Wilson wasn't entirely convinced. "Sir, I'm still detecting some anomalies in their transmission patterns. I think we need to maintain extreme caution." His warning proved prescient. Just hours later, a submarine patrol reported sighting a second Japanese force, a much larger one, approaching from the northwest on a course that would bring them directly to the actual American carriers supporting the Tarawa invasion. It was a double deception, Wilson realized. They wanted us to think their first force was a feint, so we'd focus on it while their main force approached undetected. Fortunately, the early warning provided by the submarine sighting gave Admiral Spruance time to reposition his forces. When the main Japanese fleet arrived, they found not the vulnerable invasion support ships they had expected, but a powerful American task force prepared for battle. The ensuing engagement, which would later be called the Battle of Makin, was brief but intense. American aircraft from the carriers Enterprise and Essex struck the Japanese force while it was still beyond effective striking range of the American ships. The Japanese carriers Hiyo and Junyo were severely damaged, and the heavy cruiser Mogami was sunk. The remaining Japanese vessels retreated northward, their surprise attack thwarted. In the aftermath of the battle, Wilson's signals intelligence team continued tracking the withdrawing Japanese forces. "Lieutenant," called out radioman Jenkins, "I'm picking up some unusual transmissions from the damaged carrier Hiyo. The signal pattern is erratic." Wilson hurried to the monitoring station, adjusting the equipment to better capture the transmission. "Looks like they're having power fluctuations, probably significant damage to their electrical systems." As they continued monitoring, a pattern emerged. The damaged carrier was falling behind the rest of the retreating force, its erratic transmissions suggesting increasingly severe problems. "Sir," Wilson reported to Commander Layton, "based on the transmission characteristics, I believe the Hiyo is in serious trouble. Her power systems appear to be failing, and she's separated from their main formation." Layton immediately relayed this intelligence to Admiral Spruance, who ordered a strike force of aircraft to locate and finish off the crippled carrier. By nightfall, American dive bombers had found the Hiyo, alone and struggling to maintain headway. The resulting attack sent the carrier to the bottom, a significant blow to Japan's already depleted carrier force. "Your signal analysis was spot on, Lieutenant," Layton commended Wilson afterward. "Without it, that carrier might have escaped." Wilson accepted the praise modestly, but he was already thinking ahead to how they could further refine their techniques. In the months that followed, Wilson's role expanded significantly. He established a formal training program for signals intelligence operators, teaching them not only the technical aspects of signal identification, but also the strategic thinking needed to interpret the patterns they detected. By early 1944, as the American offensive in the Pacific gained momentum, the Signals Intelligence Network had become a cornerstone of naval operations. Wilson's methods were continuously refined and integrated with other intelligence sources, creating an unprecedented level of battlefield awareness. April 10, 1944. Lieutenant Wilson stood before a room full of intelligence officers and technicians at the newly established Joint Intelligence Center, Pacific Ocean Areas in Hawaii. Now serving as Deputy Director for Signals Intelligence, he was presenting the latest enhancements to their monitoring capabilities. The network now encompasses 14 major listening stations across the Pacific, Wilson explained, indicating positions on a large wall map. "With our new high-sensitivity directional antennas, we can detect and identify Japanese naval transmissions at ranges exceeding 1,000 miles under optimal conditions." "And the cataloging system?" asked Captain Arthur McCollum, the center's director. "Complete for all major Japanese vessels, sir. We've identified unique transmission characteristics for every carrier, battleship, and heavy cruiser in their fleet, as well as most of their light cruisers and many destroyers." The achievement was remarkable. In less than a year, Wilson's improvised technique had evolved into a sophisticated intelligence system that provided Allied commanders with unprecedented visibility into Japanese naval operations. But the greatest test of the system was yet to come. June 15, 1944. American forces launched Operation Forager, the invasion of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the Mariana Islands. The strategic significance of these islands was enormous. Once captured, they would put American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The Japanese Imperial Navy responded with virtually every operational ship they had left, a desperate attempt to stop the American advance. The resulting conflict, the Battle of the Philippine Sea would become one of the decisive engagements of the Pacific War. In the Combat Information Center aboard the USS Lexington, Wilson worked with a team of signals intelligence operators to track the approaching Japanese fleet. The network of listening stations throughout the Pacific fed a continuous stream of data to the task force. Multiple contacts bearing 280 range approximately 400 miles, reported one of the operators. Signal patterns matched the carriers Zuikaku, Shokaku, and Taiho. Wilson studied the plotting board, where the positions of identified Japanese vessels were being marked. "They're committing everything they have left," he observed. 9 carriers total, based on our identifications. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the American carrier force, nodded grimly. "And we'll be ready for them. Thanks to you, Lieutenant, we know exactly where they are." The battle that unfolded over the next 2 days would become known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. With advance warning of Japanese positions and movements provided by Wilson's Signals Intelligence Network, American fighters intercepted the Japanese aircraft far from their targets. Hundreds of Japanese planes were shot down, and American submarines, also guided by the intelligence, sank 3 Japanese carriers, including the flagship Taiho. By the battle's end, Japanese naval aviation had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the most powerful in the Pacific, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. In the aftermath of the battle, Wilson received personal commendations from both Admiral Nimitz and Admiral Spruance. His signals intelligence methods had played a crucial role in the overwhelming American victory. Yet for Wilson, the most meaningful recognition came in a more private moment, when Commander Layton handed him a message from Guadalcanal. "Your old team wanted you to know the impact of your work," Layton explained. "The signal identification techniques you developed have been credited with saving thousands of American lives by providing advance warning of Japanese movements throughout the Pacific." Wilson read the message, recognizing the names of many of the technicians he had trained on Guadalcanal. Their continued success in applying his methods filled him with quiet pride. "It was never just about me, sir," Wilson said. "It was about taking an idea and developing it into something that could make a difference." Layton nodded in understanding. The best innovations often start that way. One person with an insight that, when properly supported and implemented, transforms everything. By the war's end, Wilson's signal identification techniques had become standard procedure throughout the Pacific theater. The network of listening stations he had helped establish tracked Japanese naval movements until the very last days of the conflict, contributing significantly to the final victory. In the decades that followed, the principles Wilson pioneered would evolve into modern electronic warfare and signals intelligence systems. Yet his personal contribution would remain largely unrecognized outside of specialized intelligence circles, classified for many years after the war's end. It was not until 1995, more than 50 years after his innovations on Guadalcanal, that Raymond Wilson's contributions were formally acknowledged with the award of the Distinguished Service Medal. By then, the techniques he had developed with copper wire and salvaged radio parts had evolved into sophisticated electronic systems that formed the backbone of modern naval intelligence. The citation accompanying his medal read, in part, "Lieutenant Wilson's innovative signals intelligence techniques provided Allied forces with unprecedented awareness of enemy naval movements, directly contributing to victory in the Pacific." His methods, developed initially with minimal resources under combat conditions, demonstrated exceptional technical insight and strategic vision. For the young man from Harlem, who had once believed he was merely improving field communications equipment for his fellow Marines, it was the final validation of a contribution that had helped change the course of the war in the Pacific. His wire trick, born of necessity and ingenuity, had indeed helped sink the Japanese fleet and hastened the end of the conflict. Today, in modern naval intelligence centers around the world, sophisticated electronic systems carry out the same functions that Wilson pioneered with his handmade antenna on Guadalcanal. The fundamental principle remains the same, identifying vessels not by the content of their communications, but by the unique characteristics of how they communicate. It is a lasting legacy from a time when innovation and adaptability were as important as firepower in determining the outcome of the greatest naval conflict in history. And it all began with one Marine's simple but brilliant idea about how to improve a radio antenna with some copper wire and a piece of carved wood. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.